He died on June 10, 2026. He was 84 years old. And Tamil Nadu government gave him something it does not give to many people, a state funeral with full state honors. The chief minister at his door. Every film shoot in Tamil Nadu shut down for 12 hours as a mark of respect. The question worth asking is not whether he deserved it. The question is, once you understand what he actually did to Tamil cinema, you will wonder why this does not happen more often. His name was Bharathi Raja. He was the first director to take Tamil cinema out of the studio and into real villages. He gave Sridevi, Revathi, Radhika, and a generation of women their start and changed what Tamil Nadu considered a heroine. He took a man Tamil Nadu had only feared as a villain and made the entire state fall in love with him. He gave Sivaji Ganesan, one of the greatest actors Tamil cinema had ever produced, the greatest comeback of his later career. And he pushed the biggest composer of his generation, AR Rahman, into a sound nobody knew he could make. Now, would you believe all of this was done by a man who came from a small village with no money and no film connections, working as a health inspector? Bharathi Raja was born Chinnasamy Periyamaya Thevar on July 17, 1941 in Allinagaram near Theni. His job took him from village to village, checking wells, checking for disease, sitting with families nobody in the city ever thought about. In one of those villages, Pannaipuram, he met a young musician named Jnanadesigan and his younger brother. Those two boys later became Ilaiyaraaja and Gangayamaran. And we all know Ilaiyaraaja defined the sound of Tamil cinema for the next 50 years. Bharathi Raja brought them to Chennai with him. A health inspector from Theni didn't just chase his own dream, he carried two more dreams with him, and Tamil cinema is still living inside the music Ilaiyaraaja made. Now, let's go through what he actually built. Until the mid 1970s, Tamil cinema lived inside a building. Every major director of that era shot their films inside Madras studios. Painted backdrops, artificial lighting, a village built out of plywood. In 1977, a first-time director with a budget of just 5 lakh rupees did something nobody had done before. He took his entire cast and crew out of the studio. Real fields, real homes, real soil. The film was 16 Vaidinile. It became the first Tamil film shot predominantly outdoors, and the industry had no choice but to follow him. Studios that had run for decades, AVM Studio, Prasad Studio, felt the shift. One film, just 5 lakh rupees, the entire grammar of Tamil cinema changed. But this did not come from nowhere. Most people do not know that Bharathi Raja spent 10 years as an assistant director before he was given a film of his own. He worked under 4 different directors, including the Kannada master Puttana Kanagal, who he still considers his guru. He came to Chennai with nothing. He worked at a petrol bunk to survive while staging plays on the side. This is where S.P. Balasubramaniam found him and began singing for his stage plays. SPB helped connect him to the film world, but even that first attempt at making a film together did not work out. It was only after Ilaiyaraaja broke through, the same man Bharathi Raja had brought from Pannaipuram to Chennai, that the door finally opened for both of them. 10 years of waiting, then one film that no distributor wanted to touch. The producer distributed it himself. It ran for 175 days. Silver Jubilee. And inside that film is a moment Tamil Nadu has never forgotten. Rajinikanth in 1977 was still playing villains and negative roles. 15 films that year, most of them negative characters. In 16 Vaidinile, he played Paratai, a feared local rowdy who terrorizes a village girl. And then he delivered a line, just 3 words. Idu eppadi irukku? How is it? The pass, the toss of the head, the smile. That moment became a cultural phenomenon. That line in that film, under Bharathi Raja's direction, is considered one of the early moments that showed Tamil Nadu what Rajinikanth's screen presence was truly capable of. The iconic style that an entire industry spent decades trying to copy began in a real village in a 5 lakh rupee film under that director. But the location was only the surface of what he changed. Look at who he put on screen. Tamil cinema in the 1970s had a type for its heroines, fair-skinned, studio-lit, glamorous, women who fit a mold the industry had decided was beautiful. Bharathi Raja disagreed completely. He cast women who looked like they actually belonged in the stories he was telling. Natural faces, real emotion, women who carried the weight of a scene without needing the lighting to do it for them. Some were fresh discoveries. Some were character actresses nobody had thought to put at the center of a film. Some went on to define Tamil cinema for the next 3 decades. Sridevi, Revathi, Radhika, Radha, Vadivu Karasi, Vijay Shanti, Ranjita, Priyamani, Ranjini. These were not decorations in someone else's story. He gave them the story itself. Decades before Tamil cinema started talking about representation, Bharathi Raja was already doing it quietly, film after film, without ever calling it a mission statement. Now, let me say something personal here. I have been part of scripted discussions over the years. I have seen firsthand how much work goes into a single scene. The director, the assistant directors arguing over every angle, every line, trying to find the most honest way to convey a feeling. When I look at Bharathi Raja's films, I still cannot fully imagine the thought process behind each one. He was not just writing characters, he was building human beings on screen. The specific choices, the details that make a person feel real rather than performed. That craft, consistent across decades, across completely different genres, is something Tamil cinema has not seen replicated since. There is one example worth sitting with. By 1986, Tamil Nadu had watched one actor play nearly 70 films worth of villains and negative roles. His name was Sathyaraj. Bharathi Raja looked at that body of work and saw something nobody else had. He cast Sathyaraj in Kadalora Kavidegal as a Chinnappa Das, almost a childlike man transformed by love. Not a reformed villain, not a cleaned up hero, a raw, flawed human being the audience could not help but fall for. It became a hit and gave Sathyaraj his first identity as a romantic lead after 70 films of being the man audiences feared. What made Bharathi Raja look at a villain actor and see a romantic lead is something only he could have answered. But the instinct was right and it changed Satyaraj's career. Karthik, one of the most beloved romantic heroes Tamil cinema produced, his debut came under Bharathi Raja, and none of this happened alone. Look at the people Bharathi Raja built his career with. Bhagyaraj, one of the finest screenwriters Tamil cinema has ever produced. He learned his craft directly under Bharathi Raja before becoming a celebrated director and writer in his own right. Ilaiyaraaja, the greatest music composer Tamil cinema has ever seen. The man Bharathi Raja brought from Pannaipuram to Chennai. And Vairamuthu, whose very first film song was written for a Bharathi Raja film, with Ilaiyaraaja composing the music. Three men from Theni district, director, composer, lyricist, finding each other and building something together that Tamil Nadu still lives inside. A combination like that, at their peak, working together, film after film, is something Tamil cinema has not seen since. And here is something people forget about Bharathi Raja. He did not stay in his comfort zone. After two village films, critics said the same thing. This man can only do rural stories. His answer was Sigappurojakal, a psychological thriller, urban setting, a story about a man with a dangerous obsession with a woman, completely westernized, completely unlike anything he had made before. It worked. He had just proven twice that he could define a genre and then walk away from it on his own terms. And then in 1985, he did something nobody in that era was attempting. It was also with this film that he gave Tamil cinema one of its most iconic moments, not on screen but in his own voice. For the first time, he opened the film by speaking directly to the audience. En Iniya Tamil Makkale, my sweet Tamil people. In his distinctive, booming bass voice, those words alone would make the entire cinema hall erupt in applause. It became his signature. Every film that followed carried that greeting, and every time Tamil Nadu heard it, they knew exactly who was speaking to them. By the mid 1980s, Sivaji Ganesan's moment had passed. The spotlight had shifted to a younger generation, Rajinikanth, Kamala Hassan. Many of his films through the early 1980s had quietly come and gone. Bharathi Raja gave him Mudal Maryade, the story of an aging village chief trapped in a loveless marriage who finds unexpected tenderness with a much younger boat woman. That alone would have been daring enough. But look at who he cast as the wife. Not an older actress, not someone meant to look like Shivaji's match in age. Vadivukarasi, then in her 20s playing the bitter wife, the aggressor in the marriage, the villain of the piece. So picture this, an aging legend written as a man whose own household has turned against him, married to a woman younger than his own children, would be finding real tenderness with someone younger still. It should not have worked on paper. Bharathi Raja made it the most celebrated performance of Shivaji's later career. A director built on young rural heroes gave an aging icon his greatest comeback with a cast that should have made the whole thing collapse into a melodrama. It did not collapse. It became a classic. And woven alongside that main love story is a younger thread, Ranjini, a Singaporean girl whose father was a friend of Bharathi Raja, making her screen debut in the very film. She had come to Chennai expecting a 2-week shoot. What she left with was a career and eventually a celebrated place in Malayalam cinema through films like Chitram and Swati Tirunal. And over all of it, Nilavathan Kaiyila Pudichan, Ilaiyaraaja and Vairamuthu at their finest, a song that has never aged. That is the kind of choice that looks obvious only after it has already succeeded. By the early 1990s, his long musical partnership with Ilaiyaraaja, the friendship that had shaped his very first soundtracks, had reached a difficult point. So, Bhagyaraj turned to a 27-year-old composer who had only ever made westernized classical influenced music, AR Rahman. The year was 1993. The film was Lakh and Bharat asked him to do something he had never done, pure Tamil folk music. Rahman, the composer everyone associated with orchestration and westernized sound, was being pushed into the one space he had not touched. What came out of that studio was Manuthu Mandaile, Athangara Marame. Then Kizhakku Cheemaiyile songs Tamil Nadu still hums today. I was in ninth grade when that film released. It came to Vasu Theatre in Kumbakonam. I went hours early, stood in the queue, and got tickets for my whole family. When everyone arrived, they brought me lunch in a tiffin box. The theatre was packed, full AC, every seat was taken, and when those songs started playing, I knew I was watching something I would not forget. Those songs are still in my ears. It was this one gamble on a genre nobody expected from him that proved to Rahman and to Tamil Nadu what he was capable of. They went on to make 5 films together, and the producer of Kizhakku Cheemaiyile did something that had never been done before. On the launch day wall posters, he listed just 3 names: Bharathi Raja, AR Rahman, Vairamuthu. No actors, because in this film, those 3 names were bigger than anyone in the cast. There is one more part of the story that has nothing to do with awards or genres. In 2025, 1 year before his own death, Bharathi Raja lost his son. Manoj had spent his whole life trying to walk a version of his father's path. He acted, he assisted on some of the biggest films of his generation. In 2023, he finally directed his first film, and his father acted in it alongside him. 1 year later, Manoj suffered a cardiac arrest. He was 48 years old. His brother said after Manoj's death, Bharat Raja was never the same. He would sit with his son's photos and break down. The family even took him to Malaysia, hoping a change of place might help. It did not. A man who had spent 50 years giving Tamil cinema its women, its heroes, its sound could not find his own way through this. He passed away 15 months later. One more thing before we move on. In the days since his passing, there has been some noise online. Claims about his final years, about who was or was not around him. I looked for a source for those claims. I could not find one. What I did find is this: he was surrounded by the people who loved him, his wife of over 50 years, his family, his brother, the industry he built. Rajinikanth, Kamala Hassan, the chief minister himself all came to pay their respects in person. Whatever happened inside that family in his final moments is their personal life. It is not for any of us to judge from the outside. A man who gave Tamil cinema 50 years of his life deserves to be remembered for that, not for rumors nobody can verify. If you grew up on his films and you feel something right now, that grief is real. But let his family grieve in peace. They have already lost enough. Go back to where we started, a state funeral. The chief minister at his door. Every shoot in Tamil Nadu passed for 12 hours. Now you know what that funeral was actually for. For a man who changed where Tamil films are shot. For a man who changed who gets to be the hero of a Tamil film. For a man who proved he could leave his own genre behind and succeed again. For a man who pushed the biggest composer of his generation into a territory he had never tried. He was right every time. 6 National Film Awards, a Padma Shri Award, 44 films across 5 decades. That record ends a state funeral. Nobody can argue with that. But here is another question that I want to ask. In 2014, another director passed away, known as a Iyakunar Sigaram, the peak of directors. He gave Tamil cinema some of its boldest women characters. Decades before, that became a conversation anyone else was having. His honors included the Padma Shri, the Kalaimamani, and the Dadasaheb Phalke Award, India's highest award in cinema, higher than anything Bharathi Raja received. He did not get a state funeral. In fact, another filmmaker had to publicly request that he be given one. The chief minister at that time was O. Pannirselvam. That request was not granted. So what changed between 2014 and 2026? One answer is simple. This time, the Tamil Film Active Producers Association made a formal request and the government responded. But there is a bigger question underneath that one. Tamil Nadu now has a chief minister who spent his entire life inside the film industry before he entered politics. A man who understands from the inside what it cost to build something like what Bharathi Raja built. Perhaps that is what this state funeral really signals. Not just an honor for one man, but the beginning of a Tamil Nadu that is ready to recognize its artists, its directors, its composers, its storytellers with the same seriousness it gives its political legends. If that is the trend Vijay's government is setting, will Tamil cinema finally get the recognition it has always deserved? That is a question worth watching.